The Han Dynasty fell in 220 CE, taking with it China's first golden age of imperial unity. The next 3.5 centuries, a succession of overlapping dynasties ruled amid political chaos and social upheaval. And during this time, 2 religious traditions took hold: Buddhism and Taoism. Buddhism is the most significant foreign idea ever imported into China. One might say that communism in the 20th century is a competitor, but it runs a far, far second. Buddhist monks and Buddhist sutras had been around in China since the 1st century CE. Military garrisons out along the Central Asian trade routes had facilitated cross-cultural flows between India and China. Indian monks who traveled to China learned to speak and write Chinese and explain Buddhist teachings to a curious Chinese audience. Buddhism got its first real toehold in China in the North and the Northwest, where it appealed to foreign merchants and to warriors who had already relocated there from Central Asia and beyond. But what's translated into Chinese, Sanskrit sutras attracted an even wider audience and began to spread south. Buddhism, by proclaiming that life was suffering and that desire was the cause of all suffering, addressed the chaos and misery that marked the daily lives of many Chinese in this period. Buddhism also expressed a rich artistic tradition of beautifully illuminated texts and stunning paintings and sculpture. And Buddhism was anything but a monolithic religion. It was rich and diverse and offered pretty much something for everyone, from low culture to high culture, from extreme self-denial to banking good karma through simple acts of philanthropy. All these attributes gave Buddhism a grassroots start in China. But Buddhism also gained official sanction. Government money founded great monasteries and libraries and bankrolled pilgrimages to India and also massive translation projects. One of the 16 kingdoms that ruled China in the late 4th century, somewhat confusingly known as the former Qin, was an important point of connection between China, Central Asia, and the world beyond. The former Qin ruled North China from the old imperial capital at Chang'an in modern-day Shanxi province. This is the eastern terminus of what we now call the Silk Road. Chang'an became a key node in the transmission of Buddhist teachings to China and a major center of Buddhist scholarship. The former Qin were so eager for Buddhist expertise that the state invaded Central Asia to bring back a single expert on Dharma, a monk by the name of Kumarajiva. He lived in the oasis city of Kucha. Kumarajiva was delivered to Chang'an by that army, where he directed thousands of monks in a monumental translation project. The thirst for Dharma, or Buddhist teachings, seemed unquenchable. A subsequent northern dynasty, known as the Northern Wei — don't worry, there's not going to be a test on all these dynasties — the Northern Wei eventually supplanted the former Qin and was able to impose a degree of order and a degree of unity on what had been a chaotic political environment in North China. The Northern Wei was equally eager to import Dharma. Yet they were remarkably pragmatic as well. Although its ruling clan and military aristocracy traced their heritage to the Manchurian grasslands known as the steppe in China's northeast, the Northern Wei actively recruited Chinese officials from powerful families known as magnates, families that had remained in the north. The Northern Wei thus created a hybrid imperial elite. They also saw no contradiction between their own brand of militarism, Confucianism, which is a Chinese doctrine of morality and benevolence, and Indian Buddhism. The Northern Wei were major patrons of Buddhism. They made the faith their official religion and sponsored the construction of the beautiful grottos at Yungang, which is in modern-day Shanxi province. Even more spectacular are the cave paintings, the temples, and the amazing statues at Dunhuang in present-day Gansu province, along the route linking China to Buddha's homeland in India. Those grottos survive to this day. What don't survive are the more than 1,000 Buddhist temples that once graced the Wei capital at Luoyang. Powerful magnate families also patronized great Buddhist centers and paid for the translation and distribution of Buddhist teachings or sutras. Doing so identified them as cultured and cosmopolitan, along with earning them good karma. And that's one way to live life as a Buddhist, as a layperson, sponsoring good works and trying to align yourself with the teachings of the Buddha. But if you were to pursue the monastic life, it would require supreme dedication. To become a monk, you must abandon all ties to your family and renounce even your given name. To enter the Sangha, that's the community of monks, you accept the most extreme forms of self-denial and social separation. You disavow productive work and all but the most modest material possessions. You must also take a vow of celibacy, another break from mainstream society. And you must shave your head, a symbolic renunciation of ego and vanity. Being a monk in early Imperial China couldn't have been easy. But there were rewards, such as spiritual well-being and potentially nirvana. Nirvana is a Sanskrit word meaning to extinguish. In this context, it means extinguishing the soul and ending the cycle of reincarnation and inevitable suffering that comes with reincarnation. There was also a place for women in the Sangha as nuns. Buddhist nunneries offered a refuge for Chinese women, especially for widows. Nunneries offered a path to enlightenment and an escape from the confines, the restrictions of male-dominated households. Ultimately, great monasteries, nunneries, and temples would develop into great communities of scholarship and centers of immense wealth and even power. But for the adherents of the Buddhist church and the Buddhist faith in the 4th and 5th centuries, there wasn't much material comfort. Spiritual liberation would have to suffice. Buddhism identifies 4 noble truths. First, the truth of suffering. Second, the truth of the cause of suffering, desire. Third, the truth of the end of suffering, renouncing desire. And fourth, the truth of the path that leads to nirvana, the end of suffering, the end of reincarnation. Buddhism also encompassed 3 treasures called in Chinese the Sanbao. One is the Buddha, the first to attain nirvana and the first source of enlightenment. The second treasure was the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. And the third treasure was the Sangha itself, the community of monks and nuns who embraced the Buddha and the Dharma. As much as monks and nuns existed at the margin socially of daily life in Imperial China, apart from the mainstream of work and family, the Sangha literally occupied locations at the physical margins of society. Temples and monasteries were found on hillsides and in the mountains. Moreover, Chinese Buddhism in these early times was at the margins of the Dharma. According to the monk Fa Xian, who lived in the 4th and 5th century CE, the laws governing the Chinese Sangha were, in his words, mutilated and imperfect. China's monks lacked the Buddhist equivalent of the monastic rules of, say, a Benedict or an Augustine. This is why Fa Xian, whose monastic name means something like illustrious master of the law, set out in search of the Dharma at its source in India. For great ideas and great religious traditions and for great books to take hold, they had to be physically created and physically transported. The pilgrimages of Indian monks to China and of Chinese monks to India were the physical conduits of this transformative cultural exchange. For a Chinese monk, the pilgrimage to India, like the Hajj in Islam, also represented a metaphysical journey. In the process, the Chinese Buddhist was transformed. Command of the Dharma, of the sutras, of Buddhist teachings, changed you from simply a follower to a leader of the Buddhist faith when you returned to China. Sutra bearers and their translators, fluent readers and speakers of Sanskrit, enjoyed elevated prestige and influence upon their return to China. In 399 CE, Fa Xian and a group of companions set out from Chang'an. He was probably in his early 60s. After a lengthy sojourn at the city of Dunhuang, a city of immense strategic and religious importance, the pilgrims began a perilous journey across the Central Asian deserts. As Fa Xian traveled through this harsh and forbidding realm of strange peoples and customs, he was amazed by the scholarship and sophistication of the monks he encountered. Much of what Fa Xian records in his journals concerns how life is properly and faithfully lived in the lands where the Dharma is understood and followed. This reversed the conventional view of China as the superior civilization. In the words of Fa Xian and other Buddhist pilgrims, China was the less civilized society. A foreign land, India, home of the Buddha and source of the Dharma, was the more civilized, the more superior place. Fa Xian was particularly impressed by the elaborate rituals of reverence performed for the physical relics of the Buddha, a tooth, a bone, or some possession of Prince Siddhartha. Fa Xian was equally impressed with the great size, popularity, and wealth of the temples and monasteries that housed these relics. Fa Xian found the Dharma flourishing in India, not least because the imprint of the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was everywhere. Now, along this journey, some of Fa Xian's companions had turned back for China. Others decided to remain in the land of the Buddha, and others fell ill and died. But the hardy Fa Xian carried on. Sometime around 408 CE, 9 years into this pilgrimage, Fa Xian boarded ship on India's east coast. His long journey home included lengthy stops in the Buddhist lands of modern Sri Lanka and Sumatra. It wasn't just overland routes that carried merchants and monks. Trade goods and spiritual enlightenment moved in equal measure through the maritime trading networks of Southeast Asia. Far from isolated, medieval China was plugged into the wider world by land and by sea. In 414, Fa Xian finally returned to China. The account of his 15-year pilgrimage was a sensation and found a receptive audience among the Chinese clergy and among the wealthy lay community, people curious about the homeland and true teachings of the Buddha. Many thousands of Chinese pilgrims would follow his examples in the centuries that followed. Now, Buddhism's growth as a religious institution in China inspired a complementary and in some ways competing codification of native beliefs and practices into what we call religious Taoism. Like Buddhism, Taoism encourages adherents to seek enlightenment and inspiration outside the mores of mainstream society. And unlike legalism and amoral doctrine of statecraft and Confucianism, the ancient Chinese code of morality and benevolence, which both attempt to fix the individual in relation to political and social constructs, Taoism aspires to harmonize human life with the Tao, the organic nature of the universe. There are two foundational texts of Taoism. The first is the Tao Te Ching, the classic of the way and its power, which is attributed to Lao Tzu, the semi-legendary philosopher of the 6th century BCE. The second book is the eponymous Zhuangzi, which contains the teachings of Master Zhuang, who lived at the turn of the 4th to 3rd centuries. There's a related text, the famous I Ching, or Book of Changes. It offered ways for early students of both Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi to plumb the natural order. As a result, Taoism's textual foundations long predate China's imperial unification in the 3rd century BCE. But religious Taoism only really coalesced in the 3rd to the 5th centuries of the Common Era, a period of political disunity. There was an intense appetite at the time for both Buddhist and Taoist texts that began during what's called the Three Kingdoms period of the 3rd century and accelerated during the era of the Northern and Southern dynasties, which runs from roughly 316 to 589 CE. So what are these Three Kingdoms period and what are these Northern and Southern dynasties? Well, when the Han Dynasty fell in 220 CE, there wasn't a complete systemic collapse. Instead, the Han domain was divided into 3 large states ruled by veteran military commanders and statesmen of the Han. The Three Kingdoms period is the stuff of great storytelling, such as the epic novel Sanguo Zhi Yan Yi, the romance of the Three Kingdoms. And I can highly recommend John Woo's 2-part cinematic masterpiece, Red Cliff, which is set in this period. For a brief moment at the end of the Three Kingdoms period, around the 280s, unity was restored by a dynasty called the Jin. But unlike the Qin-Han unification that had taken place in the late 3rd century BCE, the Jin triumph did not endure. Dynastic unity was sundered by a bloody succession struggle. After that brief Jin unification fell apart in the early 4th century, a coalition of 5 nomad peoples from the north and northwest invaded China and sacked both of China's ancient capitals, Luoyang and Chang'an. This marks the beginning of the Northern and Southern dynasties, roughly dividing the Yellow River watershed in the north from the Yangtze River Valley in the south. Over the course of nearly 300 years that followed, North China was home to nearly 20 different states, while the south was ruled by a succession of 5 dynasties. But it wasn't all violence and political chaos. As we've seen, the northern dynasties, like the later Qin and Northern Wei, facilitated the influx of trade and foreign belief systems, especially Buddhism. Meanwhile, the children of those wealthy magnate families I talked about, the ones who didn't find their way into government service, well, they funneled their interests and creativity into an emerging culture of leisure and Epicureanism, a culture of literary, philosophical, alchemical, scientific, and above all, metaphysical exploration. And this brings us to religious Taoism. Xu Mi and Xu Hui, a father and son team of Daoist mystics, helped fill this need for metaphysical enrichment during the late 4th and early 5th century CE. The Xus claim to be in communication with the heaven of the supreme clarity. There's a bunch of different heavens. So this is the heaven of the supreme clarity. Their received texts, known collectively as the Maoshan Revelations, after the Xu family retreat on Mount Maoshan, near modern-day Nanjing. Well, those brilliantly synthesize the philosophies of early Taoist masters with indigenous belief systems of the magnate families of the lower Yangtze Valley. Elite buy-in marked the Maoshan Revelations as a major turning point in Taoism's evolution from a loose constellation of ancient texts and beliefs to something approaching an organized religion. Supreme Clarity Taoism's appeal lay with its promise that true believers would be the privileged elite in a new Taoist order. A Taoist order ready to replace the current world of war and pestilence. There are also alchemical and magical traditions that we group under Taoism that were particularly popular during the northern and southern dynasties. Some of them were rather idiosyncratic, including schools of sexual experimentation. One particularly bizarre Taoist pursuit was elixir Taoism, which featured vision-inducing elixirs and psychedelic potions. A sub-branch was immortality elixirs, which took lots of time and lots of money to make. These were exclusively for the very wealthy. Their purpose was to bring a person's life's essence into perfect harmony with the Tao. In other words, to achieve immortality. they were super expensive, these elixirs, and they were sometimes supremely lethal. The most iconic Taoist pursuit, though, made iconic by its literati practitioners, was the rustic and natural life. If you'd been a scholar official in the 4th or 5th centuries, you might have been drawn to a life of genteel retirement, even genteel poverty. The self-denying gentleman farmer who exults in the simple life and who feels himself more in touch with nature and more in touch with the simple peasant than the effete courtiers who compete for office and prestige. The appeal of the rustic life over the public life is nicely summed up in a parable from the Zhuangzi. It goes like this. Master Zhuang was peacefully fishing one day when summoned to serve at the court of the Prince of Chu. Zhuangzi kept fishing and instead said to the Chu delegates, "I have heard that the Prince of Chu, keeps and venerates the remains of an ancient tortoise in his ancestral temple." Zhuangzi went on to ask, "Would this tortoise rather be dead and venerated or alive and wagging its tail in the mud?" Well, the two officials replied, "It would rather be alive." "Begone," cried Zhuangzi. "I too will wag my tail in the mud." In other words, it's much better to be lowly and alive than famous and dead. So the superior man is one who doesn't compete, one who transcends pettiness, the pettiness of public life. To some critics, this was just an elaborate justification for sloth, dilettantism, drunkenness, and a certain lack of professional ambition. And embracing Taoism also, in some ways, made it easier to rationalize the rise and fall of dynasties. When an individual is not personally invested in an artificial political order, it's easier to step back and think objectively about why dynasties rise and fall. And yet, the cultured magnate families who practice these sorts of belief systems, well, they endure. So while some of Taoism's appeal might have been self-serving for these elites, it still had a huge cultural impact. Art, especially painting and poetry, were core ways to transcend the artificial world, and a much safer way to achieve immortality than quaffing a poisonous elixir. And this brings us to Imperial China's first great poet, an exemplar of the Daoist rustic recluse, Tao Yuanming, sometimes styled Tao Qian, Tao the Hidden. Tao is emblematic of several cultural trends. For one, he's a purely literary figure, a poet who expresses himself outside the strictures of public life. He achieved great fame, but he had never held a great office. His ancestors had been government officials, but his own professional frustrations and personal tragedies, including the death of his beloved sister, had pushed him toward the life of a gentleman farmer and rustic poet. Tao is also emblematic of the shift south of the center of gravity of Chinese civilization. He was born in 365 in what is now Jiangxi province, just south of the Yangtze River. During the Qin and Han dynasties, this had been the empire's southern frontier. But by the 4th century, it was no longer a periphery. Tao's hometown was upstream from Jiankang, or modern-day Nanjing, which was the capital of a dynasty called the Eastern Jin. Tao almost single-handedly created an entire genre of poetry in this rich and lively region of China, as well as an entire genre of a lifestyle, too. As with Buddhism, there were many ways to live a Taoist life. You could go to the extreme and emulate the famous hermits who abandoned all the trappings of human civilization in the pursuit of the Tao. You could also be a part-time Taoist, run the rat race during the week, but on weekends and holidays, stroll in the hills or lounge drunkenly in a rustic hut in your garden. Tao Yuanming fell between those two extremes. He turned his back on public service, but stayed in the world of men, working his farm, where the world of men and the world of nature overlap. The phrase in Chinese that translates as nature or natural is 自然, literally, so of itself. This is a core concept of Taoism that Tao Yanming sought to express in his unaffected style of poetry. Here's one. I pluck chrysanthemums by the eastern fence and see the distant southern mountains. The mountain air is fresh as dusk. Flying birds return in flocks. In these things there lies as great truth. But when I try to express it, I cannot find the words. But Tao seemed content to be aware of the Tao, the great truth, without actually being able to express the words, without truly plumbing its depths. Because it liberates us from social constraints, these pursuits were facilitated by, in many cases, copious quantities of liquor. In his autobiography, Tao referred to himself as follows, I quote, "He has a special weakness for wine, but cannot always afford it. His friends, knowing this, often invite him to drink." For those of you who farm and garden, there's a certain paradox here. As much as farming is about being in tune with nature, the farmer is often at war with nature. In lean years, the life of a farmer is one of uncertainty, hardship, and poverty. Tao acknowledges this, and acknowledges the fact that a man needs food and clothing to live, and wine and companionship to enjoy life. He also infers that while life as a reclusive farmer-poet, one who is trying to describe the indescribable, might not be perfectly in accord with the Tao, it's better than the alternatives. As a result, Tao Yanming was critical of those who distanced themselves from the Tao, who tried to scratch and claw for power and prestige in the world of men. But he was equally skeptical of those who tried to cleave too close to the Tao, especially those who mistakenly thought that they could cheat nature and achieve immortality by drinking elixirs. It's clear that Tao has conflicting feelings about how close man can or even should get to the Tao. We see this in his famous work, his most famous work, the prose elegy, Peach Blossom Spring. It's a short piece, beloved and reinterpreted throughout Chinese history. In fact, a painting of it adorns the famous Long Corridor at Beijing Summer Palace. It's a utopic elegy, an absent-minded fisherman who's quite literally going with the flow. He finds himself drifting through a beautiful grove of peach trees. At the heart of the glade, his boat runs ashore, and he ventures ashore and finds himself in a fertile mountain valley. The locals are leading the good life. Nice clothes, nice houses, verdant and well-tended fields, abundant orchards and livestock. Happy parents till the fields, healthy children play under the watchful eyes of contented grandparents. But these locals are fascinated by their unexpected visitor and ply him with food, liquor, and with lots of questions. It turns out that these people's ancestors had abandoned the world of men during the Qin dynasty, several hundred years earlier, and had maintained their peaceful isolation for all those years. They know nothing of the fall of the Qin, or the rise of the Han, or the fall of the Han, or of the northern or southern dynasties. So the fisherman has a good time, but eventually takes his leave. And as he's leaving, the villagers implore him not to speak of this place, the Peach Blossom Spring. But he does, unsurprisingly. But also unsurprisingly, all efforts to rediscover this sort of Chinese brigadoon are in vain. You can sense here Tao Yanming's ambiguous feelings about the Tao. This little paradise is both unrealistic and kind of dull. And the fisherman is quite drunk by the time he leaves, so we might be a little suspicious about what the place is actually like, or is it just a boozy dream? Ultimately, this paradise on earth, like the Tao itself, can be found only when you're not looking for it. So really, what's the point of life in search of the Tao? Pass me the wine jug. That kind of honest humor and ambiguity are why Tao Yuanming was and is such a revered and beloved figure in China. The 350-year span that encompassed the three kingdoms and the northern and southern dynasties gets short shrift in most surveys of Chinese history. Lacking imperial unity, it's sometimes looked on as something of an afterthought. But I hope that it's apparent that in the realms of religious inquiry and cultural expression, this period of disunity shouldn't just be a footnote. It's also important to survey this period because it does not strain the imagination to think of the land once united by the Qin and Han dynasties as something permanently divided north and south. Politically, the North was increasingly dominated by a military caste whose heritage and strategic focus were bound to Central Asia and to the great steppe pastures of the North and Northeast. The South, meanwhile, was moving farther south and plugging into the maritime economies and polities of Southeast Asia. What's more, the elites of the region south of the Yangtze River increasingly saw themselves as protectors and perpetuators of Chinese culture, in opposition to what they viewed as northern barbarians. And yet the Chinese Empire would be reunified once again in the late 6th century. And despite an enduring north-south tension, Imperial China remained essentially unified until the 20th century. That was no mean feat. It stands as an accomplishment that matches and perhaps exceeds Imperial China's first unification under the Qin and the Han.